now and can confirm. But to give you a sense of this area, there have been many journalists, including our own crews there over the past week, documenting what's happening as Ukrainian forces try to hold a front line from the Russian advance. And this information that we're learning right now, indicating from someone on the ground who was at the scene, that these two journalists got into a car to go closer to where the front line was at, and ultimately they were shot. We don't know who shot them, but this is an active war zone. And again, we can confirm at this hour that one American civilian journalist was killed just outside the capital of Kyiv.
That's terrible to hear, Trey. Would we have any ability to ascertain or get a sense of whether or not Russians would have known these are Americans, would have known these are reporters? Were they again, I know that it's just early, but any other details you can add as far as how far away were the people shooting at them, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead in terms of the information about this incident, just because we're still gathering information on it. But I can give you a sense of where they were at and how they got to that location, because we were there on Friday. And basically there is an area, a town called Irpin, about 60,000 people, and it is the front line of this conflict right now on the northwestern side of Kyiv. And basically a bridge has been taken out there. Ukrainians bombed it in an effort to stop the Russian advance. And many civilians, thousands of them, have been crossing this bridge from two towns, Irpin and Bucha, that currently are partially controlled by Russian forces. So it is the location where one of the stories around this conflict is taking place. And so journalists are going there to document these evacuees and those who are trying to flee the Russian advance. And these journalists went to an area just next to that bridge in order to get closer to the front. And according to our source on the ground, they approached a checkpoint and were shot. We don't know if this was an area that was controlled by the Russians or the Ukrainians at this point, but those journalists, according to photos that I've viewed, had protective gear on. There was another journalist injured, and a video clip of him as he's being treated says that the man who was killed was shot in the neck. That's all the information we have about that specific shooting. But they would have clearly been marked as journalists. They had press credentials on them, and it's unclear what exactly led up to the moment they were shot.
At a checkpoint, that is a detail we're hearing for the first time. Trey, thank you for that. We've been talking throughout the morning about the nature of the coverage, the video that you see from, or you do not see, from the front line. As it informs this story, Trey, can you just give us some insight? Are reporters embedded with Ukrainian forces? Are they driving around, moving around independently? Do you have your own security force that accompanies the journalist, security detail that accompanies journalists as they move around the countryside? How do you negotiate Ukraine?
Every crew is different, and on the ground right now, every place that you go has its own obstacles. And so we travel with a security team. Some journalists do not. But each day you have to make a calculation and a risk assessment about how far you want to go and how close you want to get to the front where things are happening. So today, for example, we went to the eastern side of Kyiv, where a few days ago a Russian tank column advanced on the capital and was immediately met with fierce resistance by Ukrainian forces. We spoke with many of those troops that were pushing back the Russians, and Russian forces were a few kilometers away from where we were at today, and they've actually stopped the advance on that one road. But like I said, it's changing each and every day, and that's why you have to reassess every morning before you go out and gather information. In terms of the ability to embed with Ukrainian forces, most of the time you're not able to do that. It's early on in the conflict, and those forces are focused on fighting the war. There are members of the territorial defense. These are largely reserve forces that are participating. And so we've spoken with a number of them. We've also spoken with soldiers in the army, but the ability to embed with them in locations around Kyiv right now is not possible, and no one's doing it. In the future, it may be a possibility, but we are getting more images from the army, and the Ukrainians are fighting a fierce resistance on the outskirts of this city. We've seen the video provided by the military here, and it shows the use of these anti-tank missiles, these Stinger missiles, different small arms that they're using to really meet the Russian forces outside the city and try to hold those firm lines.
Trey, you mentioned this checkpoint. Have you been warned at any point that approaching a checkpoint would be a dangerous thing to do? Or is that something that, you would, for example, think you could safely do?
Every checkpoint is different. And in a town like Irpin, where we have reported extensively for 3 days over the past week and a half, we've been in this area, it's difficult to know which streets are safe and which streets are not safe. And so when we report a checkpoint, we do not know if that was a Ukrainian checkpoint or a Russian checkpoint. We're gathering the information at this time. Early reports indicate they were shot by Russian forces, but I cannot independently confirm who shot these journalists. It is important to note also, in a city like Irpin, the front lines are changing all the time. So any given day, you could go down a street, and the next day you go to that same street, and it's controlled by Russian
Absolutely.
forces. And we found that even when we were there, you would go down one street, and sometimes Ukrainian soldiers or even civilians would start flagging you down and tell you to turn around because the Russians were that close. And while we were in this town of Irpin on Friday, there were Russian shells landing all around a neighborhood. We brought this story to Fox, but we interviewed a man who was blind, and he was stuck in this town. And as we were at his house speaking with him, these Russian shells were falling in that neighborhood. So it gives you a sense of just how close these front lines are. And as a journalist, when you approach a checkpoint, you have to always just be prepared, not knowing what could take place. But such a tragic story that we are learning today, one American journalist killed. And again, we cannot independently confirm where the shots were fired from.
Trey, we're all measured in moments like this to make sure to not get ahead of information. First reports can often be wrong, but and you've been measured in this as well. But we're now getting confirmation on our end from the New York Times that it was a New York Times reporter who was killed on the ground. And they put out a statement just moments ago on behalf of him. The New York Times saying, "We are deeply saddened to hear of Brent Renaud's death. Brent was a talented filmmaker who had contributed to the New York Times over the years. Though he had contributed to the Times in the past, most recently in 2015, he was not on assignment for any desk at the Times in Ukraine. Early reports that he worked for the Times circulated because he was wearing a Times press badge that had been issued for an assignment many years ago." So, Trey, the New York Times confirming the name of the journalist who had at times worked with the New York Times, but appears to have been working in some other independent form there.
I can also independently confirm the name. Obviously, we always want to be careful before we name these journalists or anyone killed in conflict so their family can be notified. But now that a public statement is issued, I can independently confirm that is the journalist. He is a filmmaker, a very decorated filmmaker. And according to a source that we have on the ground in Irpin, he was taken out by Ukrainian forces after this happened. Again, we don't know exactly where within
He was
Irpin,
evacuated by Ukrainian forces, you're saying?
Correct. He was taken out, but evacuated, yes. Taken out of the area by Ukrainian forces, evacuated by those soldiers who were able to get him and his colleague out of this area.
Wow.
All right, Trey Yingst, thank you for that update this morning.
Can I ask one more question?
Of
just real
course.
quick, because I'm sincerely curious, and you kind of asked it. Trey, when the nature of the fighting on the front lines, and you did talk about it, but because this is a reporter, and we don't, reporters are not, you work very hard, Trey, not to be a part of the story. You're reporting what's happening there. But when you get that front, in this case, tragically, an American journalist has become a part of the story. In Iraq and Afghanistan, if you were an embedded reporter, you could count on the protection of an American unit that you were traveling with, you lived with, you were housed with, and ultimately would medevac you or take care of you if you were in a hostile combat situation. So you got a lot of those pictures from the front lines because of that security. Based on your experience, how much different is your calculation of risk then? You've talked about risk assessments. I mean, you can't really count on anybody being there. I mean, maybe some personal security. And you said some journalists don't have any security at all. So if you're in a vehicle approaching a checkpoint, you're counting on the forces there, be that Russian or Ukrainian, to be able to decipher whether this is a civilian vehicle, a military vehicle, or a press vehicle. I can't imagine balancing that kind of ambiguity.
It can be quite difficult. And, we are experienced in these areas of conflict, and you always try to stay calm and try to communicate as much as you can, even if you're not directly speaking the language. We travel with a fixer translator and also a security member in each one of our vehicles. But the reality is people are being killed around us in these areas. So people who are at checkpoints, soldiers, are quite on edge. And anything that moves often can be a target. We experience that today, even on the front lines in the East. Speaking with these soldiers, you have to approach very slowly wherever you go. And in a place like Irpin, where this tragedy took place today, it is very messy. And as we talked about, street to street, things can change. And there are a lot of brave journalists out on the front lines. They don't want to become the story. They want to capture the story and shine light in this very dark area. But it can be extremely difficult to make that calculation. And it's part of why we rely on our security teams with us for gathering as much information as they can throughout the day while we are focused on reporting. And then in the morning, they can brief us. We actually had planned to go to this area today, and our security team checked in, and we ultimately made a decision to go to a different area. But each and every day, every person who is out here covering this story will make a calculation, and they will make a decision and then head to that location to report the news.
Well, we're grateful that your security team gave you good advice. Trey, it was great talking to you. Please stay safe.
Yeah,
we're
thank you,
praying
Trey.
for you. I talked to him yesterday, by
Thank
the
you.
way, when I was on the big Saturday show, and I asked him about his safety. And the professional that he is, he was like, nope, this